Hello, this is Philippe, and I'm here to present NewsPod, automatic and interactive news podcasts at IUI. Podcasts are on the rise, with 57% of US adults saying they obtain some of their news on audio-only platforms such as radio and podcasts. However, handcrafting podcasts can be expensive. For example, The Daily from the New York Times usually involves a team of professionals to produce, including a host, producers, editors, engineers, as well as musicians. Automation exists, but it is limited. With the advance of text-to-speech, some news organizations offer what we call playback options. In the example here, Bloomberg offers on each of its news article on the website an option to listen to the article, where automatic text-to-speech is used to produce an audio version of the news article. However, there is a difference between automatic podcasts and handcrafted podcasts. On the one side, handcrafted podcasts, the text is adapted to the audio format. There can be multiple voices and it feels conversational, and there can be use of music, sounds to enrich the experience. On the other hand, with automatic podcasts, the content is usually not adapted to the audio format. There's usually the use of a single synthetic voice, and it can overall feel pretty monotonous. The question we ask is, can we go further with automatic podcasts and take some of the features from handcrafted podcasts into the design? Let's look at some of the design that we put into the NewsPod system. The way we want the user to interact with the system is the user comes in and selects stories that they're interested in to automatically generate a podcast on. The user can optionally select a duration for the podcast, for instance, 8 minutes or 12 minutes. Then a podcast will be generated on demand, and it'll be made of several segments. First, an introductory segment, and then one segment for each of the stories they selected, and a closing sentence at the end. The introductory and closing segments are fairly simple. However, we'll focus on how do we build the segments for the stories themselves. For the story segments, we follow the inverted pyramid writing style. We start with an introduction, which contains a headline and a summary, followed by a Q&A session made of sequence of questions and answers. And finally, we can end with a quote. You can see here on the right an example script that was generated for one of the stories. And particularly, we use several voices to make the podcast segment feel conversational. So in blue, you have the main host, and then in red, you have the questioner, and then in green, you have the quote reader. The objective here is to make the podcast feel more conversational, reduce monotony, and invite the listener to join the conversation. How do we generate the QA session automatically? First, we obtain news articles about the given topic. Then we organize the content into paragraphs. For instance, we might have 60 paragraphs on a given topic, which is too much to put in one segment, and we have to do some filtering. And then we use a QGen and QA pipeline here on the right to generate questions and then find the answers we think are most informative for these questions. Finally, the last component of the system is we allow the users to ask their own question. The user can click on a button, the system pauses, they can ask a question, and then we use a Q&A system to try to find the answer to the question and deliver it to the user before resuming the podcast. In one of the studies, we look at whether users want to ask questions, and if so, what kinds of questions they ask. Okay, now let's look at a demo of the system.
Welcome to the NewsPod podcast. NewsPod is an automatic and interactive news podcast. Listeners can select which topics to include. The podcast simulates a conversation with multiple voices. During the podcast, the listener can ask questions. Today, we'll cover 4 stories. Switzerland burqa ban, Senegal jailed opposition leader, Rohingya crisis in India and Tesla self-driving safety. Let's get started. Next up, Switzerland burqa ban. Switzerland votes to ban wearing of the burqa or niqab in public spaces. Referendum denounced by rights group as needlessly fueling division and fear, after Swiss right-wing party had framed it as verdict on the role of Islam in public life.
How many people wear the burqa in Switzerland?
I'll look into that. I think the answer is 30. I got it from the following paragraph. She told AFP that the proposed law created the impression of a problem, but there are only 30 women in burqas in Switzerland.
And what is the reason for the burqa ban?
I'll look into that. I think the answer is a test of attitudes towards Muslims. I got it from the following paragraph. A far-right proposal to ban facial coverings in Switzerland appears to be heading for a narrow victory in a binding referendum viewed as a test of attitudes towards Muslims.
What percentage of the population are Muslims?
Muslims make up around 5% of the Swiss population of 8.6 million, or about 390,000 people, most of whom have their roots in Turkey, Bosnia and Kosovo.
When was the veil banned?
France banned the wearing of a full-face veil in public in 2011 in Denmark. Austria, the Netherlands and Bulgaria have full or partial bans and wearing face coverings in public.
Ines El-Sheikh, Spokeswoman for the Purple Headscarves feminist Muslim women's group said, "This is clearly an attack against the Muslim community in Switzerland. What is aimed here is to stigmatize and marginalize Muslims even more."
Next up, Senegal jailed opposition leader. That's it for today. Thanks for tuning in.
All right, let's look at the first user study we ran around the choice of format for the system. We ran a 15-minute study with 60 participants. In the study, participants selected 5 stories of interest out of a choice of 7, and then they listened to an 8-minute podcast that contained roughly 90-second segments about each of the 5 stories that they selected. They gave feedback on each of the segments as to whether it was coherent and interesting. Finally, at the end of the podcast, they shared their thoughts about the overall experience. Participants were assigned to one of 4 different formats for the podcast. Formal news, in which there's no conversational element. We pick one of the news articles we have about the story and select the first 5 paragraphs, and that is the podcast segment. So this is a baseline. QA random, in which we generate the questions, we find the answers, but we randomly sample which questions and which answers we put in the segment. QA best is our main system, in which we use a greedy algorithm to select the questions we think are most relevant and most informative for the user. And then QA reference is handwritten by one of the authors of the paper, and it's in the conversational format as well. However, it's not automated, so it's not going to have any of the NLP flaws that might be there in the other automated systems. We look at 3 research questions. First, comparing reference and formal news. Is the QA format adapted for news podcasting, and is it interesting to the users? Second, is there a big gap between QA best and QA reference? When we use NLP, are there flaws that are reducing the quality of the podcast? And then finally, between QA random and QA best, how effective is that greedy algorithm I mentioned at selecting content compared to QA random, which might have more incoherence and more redundancy? Looking at the results, we find that users rated on a Likert scale from 1 to 5 stars for each segment on interestingness and coherence. And we find that the reference segments got the highest score, followed by QA best, then formal news, and then QA random. Looking at the questions, the QA format, QA reference, was statistically significantly preferred over all the other 3, and in particular over formal news, meaning that the QA format was interesting to users. The gap between QA best and QA reference indicates that currently NLP has flaws and they translate to lower quality of the segments. And then finally, QA random does much worse than QA best, particularly on coherence, showing that the greedy algorithm we use in QA best helps make the podcast more interesting and more coherent than just randomly sampling questions. Looking at the second study, interaction for the users. Here, the questions are slightly different. First, we are interested in whether participants want to ask questions at all or not. Second, if we include breaks, does that encourage more users to ask questions? And third, are current QA models capable of answering open-ended questions from users during a podcast? We follow a very similar setup to study A, except that we now add the opportunity for the user to ask questions. They can either type their question, or we also have 2 recommended questions that they can click on. In the real demo, people could speak out their questions by clicking on a button and using speech recognition. However, for a 15-minute study, we lower the barrier and we can get more questions and we can do better analysis. Participants were randomly assigned to one of 2 settings, either with break, in which at the end of each segment, the system would say, we're at the end of this segment. If you have any questions, now is a good time, and wait some number of seconds, or without break, in which the system just reads the last sentence and then just starts right away with the next segment. What we find is that, yes, a majority of participants in both cases want to ask questions. However, when you include breaks, this goes from 55 to 85% of the participants. So a large majority of participants ask questions, and it goes from on average 2.4 questions in the podcast to 4.3 questions. So it helps increase the fraction of participants that ask questions and the number of questions we get. However, the current systems we find are not quite adequate at answering questions from the participants. On the one hand, participants were fairly satisfied with the answers to the recommended questions they clicked on, with 79% of participants being happy with those. But for their own questions, participants weren't quite happy, with only 26% of them being satisfied with answers to questions they typed. We did an in-depth analysis of the questions they asked to understand why the answers were dissatisfying. And what we found is that there's very high diversity in the types of questions participants asked, and our current QA models are only capable of answering a subset of those. So you can see here, out of the 7 categories, only 3 of them, QA models are capable of answering those. And what this means is we need to improve our QA models. This gives future direction as to what kinds of questions people are interested in asking these kinds of systems. Thank you for paying attention. Feel free to check out the demo. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.